Hello everyone, my name is Eric DeBold. I'm a graduate of Loyola University, their Bachelor's in Environmental Science program, as well as an alum of the Student Conservation Association. I was a crew leader in one of their community conservation crews a couple summers ago, so we just helped lead some high schoolers on some conservation projects, building a nature playground at a forest preserve in the area, as well as clearing out a lot of invasive species that were popping up in the surrounding forest. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be going on a lesson for learning how to leave no trace at the beach. Um, and that's just going to involve hopefully getting a couple skills at the end of this. Our goals are to be able to teach our peers about some of the typical impacts we see and can have when we visit the beach, as well as learn about how to mitigate those impacts, strategies to minimize those, and improve everyone's experience at the beach by trying to leave no trace. After this, some of the outcomes will be that participants are going to be able to explain our 7 leave no trace principles, summarize them to their peers, be able to discuss ideas on how to incorporate leave no trace into their trips, whether it's to the beach or hopefully even to other areas as well. And at the end of this, figure out how to have a safe trip to the beach, other outdoor spaces, in a way that maximizes everyone's enjoyment and experience, whether it's animals and wildlife or people that are visiting. You're not going to need too much for this, just a pad and paper and hopefully a spot by the beach or some water if it's accessible. But if you can get outside, that's really best. All right, let's go along. All right, so if any of you guys have been to a beach or been in the areas near waterways, it's important to introduce how important waterways are as a service not only to us, but to the greater world around us, and understanding how water really links everything between our spaces in urban and rural areas to the wildlife and what we consider wilderness. The important things to consider are ecosystem services that different waterways can provide. One of the most essential ones is filtration of different water and toxins that can be transported throughout the water, such as acid rain, sulfur and nitrous oxides, pollutants in the air that then precipitate down through rainwater, waterways, and the surrounding banks and vegetation really help filter out a lot of the toxins before they even reach some of our systems of drinking water, and keeping those waterways healthy, promoting native vegetation, keeping them clear of litter and further pollutants really allows them to continue to strengthen themselves and provide those ecosystem services for us. So our water is safer by the time we get to drink it. Another important thing, again, going into what we touched on about native species, it's really important to consider what species might be critical habitat, or the waterway you're visiting might be their critical habitat. You want to make sure that we're not imposing too much, infringing upon the habitat of endangered species, or an endangered habitat that needs its current species to really thrive. If we lose certain species that are considered keystone in that environment, it could cause a rippling effect and lead to kind of destruction of the health of that environment. So even a simple beaver and an otter in a lot of our different waterways, beaches, and even down to the different microorganisms, if the composition of the water or the habitat is not suitable for any of those organisms and they are taken out of the food chain, not being able to be predators or prey, it could lead to a snowballing effect in the health of that ecosystem. There's inherent beauty to each location, and it's up to us as visitors at that time to preserve that beauty later down the road for anyone else who's going to visit. And so especially for beaches, when we're talking about leaving no trace, and everything that we pack in, we must pack out. It's important to plan ahead when we're visiting those beaches, so that we know how to minimize our impacts, what's allowed, where we can set up, and everything that goes along with that. So now, if you're able to, I want everyone to find a small group, hopefully of 2 or 3, and we're just going to sit down and kind of discuss the information that we just went over. And feel free to add to that, and any experiences that you've had that kind of relate to what we just talked about, and write down the 3 most interesting things you learned, the 3 most pressing questions that you have, and the 3 most impactful things that you look to share with others. Okay, so now we're just going to introduce the 7 principles of Leave No Trace. We kind of briefly touch upon some ideas we want to think about when we typically travel to the beach, and how we could kind of mitigate the common mistakes and behaviors that we kind of make that end up leaving a trace that we may not intend to. So the first thing that we want to discuss is probably the most important and present throughout all the principles, throughout the whole time you're on your trip. It's to plan ahead and prepare. It really lays the foundation for a great trip. The first question you want to ask is it safe for us to even go to the place we're trying to visit? A lot of people don't even think, they just know people have been there and they're going to assume that it's safe. It might be an uncommon issue during a certain season when we're trying to visit that might block us from being able to go. And something like that occurs often is algae blooms in lakes across the Great Lakes and different rivers, especially near farmland. Algae blooms is when there's a lot of eutrophication in the lake. There's tons of fertilizer runoff, and there's a lot of nutrients that are available for algae to grow and bloom, and that ends up just making the lake too toxic for other animals and even ourselves to be able to swim, and deprives the lake of oxygen and ends up killing a lot of fish out in those areas. So that's something that really could be uncommon, that's becoming more and more common, that we want to try and avoid. Planning ahead and preparing, especially around the Great Lakes, is really important during the spring and summer seasons. When talking about the length of your trip, you want to make sure that all your participants are ready and willing, especially given whatever weather conditions you might run into. And preparing food and drink is, of course, essential. You want to make sure you have enough to enjoy the day, keep yourself full and healthy. And one of the things to make sure we can do that and also avoid leaving a trace is trying to repackage our snacks that we purchase ahead of time. They come in a lot of unnecessary packaging that's easy to lose, miscarry, and get blown away in the wind, especially on the beach where there's not a lot of cover for wind. We lose track of a lot of the things that we easily take apart. So wrappers for granola bars, chip bags, pieces of stray food, other snacks. We just want to repackage them into reusable containers that we have a different case for. A lunchbox is perfect. If you have one left over from school, you can easily go pick up one from the thrift store, and just some glass containers or jars. Pasta sauce jars are really good. Even just plastic bags. There's also reusable bags you can always grab, and shopping bags that are always available. Just trying to find ways to minimize the plastic that we're packing in, and so trying to find reusable containers to put our materials in that we'll use every time. Keep in an area when we know we're going to go on a trip or a beach. It's perfect, and it saves a lot of waste. We want to travel on durable surfaces. Beaches are usually durable surfaces, considering that they're made of the sand. I'm here on a rock one here in my apartment complex, but it's very much a durable surface. You just want to make sure that you're considerate of not only the other visitors there, but the integrity of the environment. Basically, if you think you're going to disturb some of the integral parts of the environment, perhaps in the desert where there's biocrusts, that's a type of sand environment that we might want to avoid. Might not be as much of a durable surface, but you want to concentrate to areas that have already had visitors, that are cordoned off for visitors, especially ones that have high traffic use. We don't want to create campsites, beach setups where people haven't been, because then we're expanding the boundaries of what was once considered just for recreational space. Disposing of waste properly goes back to planning ahead and preparing. If you're able to look into what kind of waste receptacles will be there, bring appropriate trash bags for yourself, and repackage and minimize waste that you will be bringing into the trip. Disposing of waste properly is a lot easier that way. The problem happens when we don't plan and prepare, and then we don't have places to properly store, our waste, or we don't foresee problems that create waste when we thought we weren't bringing it in the first place. On beaches, it's really important to leave what you find. That includes any sort of rocks, any sort of mementos, and anything like shells. We want that we leave the ecosystem as we found it, as each piece of it is integral to its survival. For example, a lot of places that have shells, those shells offer refuge for crabs, shelter for other different organisms, and if we take one piece away, and we're all taking a piece away, then that ecosystem loses a lot of the pieces that keeps its organism safe and keeps it intact. So there's not a lot of wiggle room for trying to take souvenirs. The best advice is to leave only footprints and take only pictures, and there's plenty to see. If you're going to be hanging out on a beach, it's good to minimize the impacts of campfires. Think about if you really need a campfire on the beach, and what other opportunities there are to enjoy whatever activities you're trying to plan without a campfire. It's really best to avoid any sort of scarring in the landscapes you're visiting. And if you really have to build a campfire, you want to make sure it's elevated off of the sand, or that there's a proper thermal structure separating the bottom of the fire and the landscape that you're visiting, so that is not to char the landscape. And also, once the coals are physically cool to the touch, you can scatter them using a dispersal method in an area that allows for proper disposal, or pack them out, which is always the best option. You also want to respect wildlife. Again, take only pictures and leave only footprints. When you're viewing wildlife, it's best to make sure that wildlife cannot view you. When you're at the beach, there's a lot of opportunity for listening into the wildlife and just enjoying the scenery, especially at night. If you don't need a wildfire or a campfire, you can always just sit back, lay back, and enjoy the stars. But maybe not if it's a cloudy night. Most importantly, it's really essential to be considerate of other visitors. If you have to lower your voice, or maybe not talk at all, to let somebody else enjoy the sounds of nature, it's a perfect opportunity to sit back and do the same thing yourself. A lot of people come to nature as an escape, and it's good to find ways to just sit back and enjoy the different things that are out there, especially the sounds of nature and any sounds of water. A lot of us don't get the chance to get outside or be near bodies of water, so when we do have the chance to enjoy the beach, it's best to let the natural sounds that we usually don't hear provide the therapy that they're there to provide. The aesthetic beauty is there in all the locations that we visit, and part of preserving that for those coming after us is allowing not only the sights of nature to come through, but also the sounds. When you're hiking on different paths along the beach or setting up camp, make sure to give yourself and your other guests and the other guests of the area you're visiting enough of space. Especially during the pandemic, it's appropriate to keep social distancing and to allow people to pass when they need to. Some beaches allow for horseback riding and other vehicles. Again, it's part of planning ahead and preparing, but you want to make sure that you know the different rules of the area you're visiting, and being considerate of others. Usually hikers yield to the horses, but make sure when you're doing that, you're not creating any sort of social trails, and you're going off trail responsibly, preferably on a durable surface, any sort of rock, to allow for other people to pass, or yourselves if other people are trying to let you pass. Consideration is really the foundation of Leave No Trace. Critically thinking about different aspects of how your actions can impact not only others' experience, others being different visitors, or the wildlife of the area that you're visiting. You just want to, again, practice consideration in planning ahead and preparing, and making sure that you're not disturbing the area that you're in. You're taking pictures and just leaving footprints, and preferably being considerate of others while you're there, wildlife and other